Okay, so I'm just gonna pull up my timer. I have 7 minutes with a 30-second grace period for this speech. My name is Maggie. I'll be the first and third speaker for side government from BARD. My time will start in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so first we decided to define this house as the U.S. federal government, and we decided to define the framework for this round as net benefit, so just whatever side is going to have more benefits. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about the framing of the round, so what this actually looks like. As stated in the motion, a company or investor is able to fund lawsuits for a portion of the money won. The money is probably in partnership with a lawyer or law firm, and individuals where legal fees and other initial burdens can be covered by the money given by investors. Now we have a few observations here. First observation is why class action lawsuits are good. We think that in general, class action lawsuits are really great for the average person. Why is this? If a problem is affecting a large group of people, such as a faulty product, it's really unlikely that one person has enough resources or the ability to champion a lawsuit all on their own. If you're one person who is affected by a bad corporate product, you do not have the money, you do not have the resources to go pursue actually suing this corporation. And usually when this is a fault on behalf of a corporation, the scope of the impacts are really large. So there's other people who had to deal with this problem. So you see class action lawsuits are a method in which those people can get their voices heard. And now who is actually affected by class action lawsuits? In most cases, these lawsuits are not going to be brought against individuals who do not have a lot of money or small companies like small businesses. If you have to split the money between a few different parties, this means less money for yourself. So because of this, the amount of money made off of lawsuits to few individuals or small businesses is not going to be worth it for any party involved. We also think that the scope of the harm is never going to be large enough in the case of small businesses to justify or even have a class action lawsuit in the first place. This means that primarily this will affect wealthy private individuals and large corporations. Our third observation. The government is typically involved in class action lawsuits where judicial departments will choose to take on a burden to represent the citizens harmed by corporations. Right? So we see a lot of times the government helps represent these people who are affected by this corporate wrongdoing, and the government is involved in these class action lawsuits. When they can get these funders, this means that it'll be easier for the government to do this and that they can do this better. Okay, now getting into our case. Our first contention is more/better lawsuits. So when funders engage in these lawsuits and have the opportunity to sue a company and aid in the suing of a company, there's more incentive for these to happen. We see that the biggest barrier for people to start class action lawsuits is when they don't have the funds or don't know how to do so. When you have Champerty, you can do this better. Okay, so there's a few options here. So A is settling out of court. Typically, most lawsuits are settled out of court with Champerty. This increases, allowing for more people to get settlements with more ease. Another option is settling in court. So if class actions go to trial, Champerty also increases their likelihood of success because there's more funds that can go into that trial. We see that the trial is going to be better. There's going to be just better accusations that these corporations are going to face. So we see that big corporations will often try to extend trials, right, because they think that the other side doesn't have enough money or the funds. So they extend the trials, which takes time and money that the plaintiffs cannot always cover. So if we propose this, or if we legalize this, this means that they will be able to continue to fight and they will actually be able to pursue getting compensation for the harm that they have dealt with, right? So we ultimately see that this is going to lead to a lot more benefits because they're not going to have to eventually give up the fight. Okay, and now we see this with experts. We see that experts, this is still on our first contention. We see that the investors/companies that will be involved in providing the funds are probably specialized in lawsuits and law. This means that they want to make smart investments. They're also often social movement groups with special causes that they want to champion, or other corporations who are specializing in this field, other corporations trying to compete. This expertise, thus, can be passed down to the class action lawsuits, and they're more likely to succeed. We see that rather having just one or a few experts from one side working on this, you have experts in this field, and this field, and this field, and this field. More resources, more experts, more expertise. This means that this class action lawsuit is going to be done better on our side. Okay, now moving on to our second contention, which is about better corporations. First point on this is aware consumers. Class action lawsuits, particularly large ones, attract a lot of attention in the media, right? If this big company is getting sued for a lot of money, there are going to be headlines about this. There's going to be reporting about this. So we see that when there is more reporting, more consumers find out about these class action lawsuits. They find out about this and this and this and this, and they will be more aware about potential corporate harms. They will be more aware of the products that they're consuming. They will be more critical, and they will only want to buy really, really good products, which makes these corporations better, and also makes consumers better, makes consumers safer, it makes consumers happier. Our second subpoint on this is better corporate action. So when corporations have the constant threat of a competitor, citizens, or law firms pursuing these class action lawsuits at a higher rate because they have more incentive to, it's easier, the lawsuits are going to be better, they're going to try to cause less harm. Right? This means that they're going to have all of this pressure on them. They're going to be trying to make better products so that they don't have to face these class action lawsuits, which on our side, they will actually face the consequences of more. So we'll see that these corporations are going to have better products. They're going to try to do a better job. They're going to just in general be better corporations and are better going to serve their consumers a lot more. Right? So we see that there's better consumers and better corporate action. Additionally, if consumers are hearing about these things more and they're hearing about more class action lawsuits, and then the consumers become more aware, this attracts more attention and more focus on these companies, which makes the company act better. Right, we primarily see here that, oh yeah, consumers are going to find out about this, and the consumers are going to be more critical consumers. They're going to be more aware consumers. So we're ultimately going to see that these companies, again, have to act better to live up to the consumers' expectations, right? So we see this with the constant threat of losing these lawsuits, and we see this with consumers wanting to consume better products. We have better corporations in our world, which in turn means better consumers. So what are the impacts of this contention? We see that there's less climate change, right? A big site of class action lawsuits is pollution, is climate change, is the effects of people who are living near these potentially like factories or something like that. So we see that when more class action lawsuits are being brought against these companies, there's going to be less climate change, right? There's less pollution because these companies are going to try and act better, and they're not going to want to deal with these lawsuits, and they're not going to want to look as bad, so they're going to have less pollution. So it's the same thing with, let's look at bad cancer or unhealthy ingredients within, or more cancer and unhealthy ingredients in the food. Corporations are not going to want to make their products unsafe. They're going to want to make everything look better. They're going to want to make everything better. They're not going to include carcinogens in their products. So we're ultimately going to see that consumers are going to be healthier. Everyone's going to be healthier. We'll also see better healthcare, right? If they give really bad healthcare, this is another side of class action lawsuits. Working conditions, better products. Overall, all our impacts are super important because the government's job is to protect the well-being of their citizens. In a world where large corporations continue growing in power and money, as governments, there's a duty to make sure that this power isn't used to mistreat people. For all these reasons, vote side government. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. My name's Thomas Greenleaf. I'll be the first speaker for the litigation side from Menlo-Atherton. Quickly off time, I'll just go over framework, then the neg case, and then the AF case. Is everyone ready? All right, my time will begin on my first word in 3, 2, 1. Now, okay, at the top of case, I think we agree broadly with the definitions. This house ought to be the U.S. federal government. The weighing mechanism ought to be net benefits. We think specifically for the judicial system, as the government probably cares a lot about that, and that's what they would be thinking about when determining the legality of Champerty. As to the observations, first of all, we think that the first observation is generally pretty good. We think that it's often companies or investors who are funding these lawsuits. We think investors often like have a bunch of lawsuits going, right, to sort of diversify their risk away, sort of like subprime mortgages in 2008. On their second point here about like class action lawsuits being good, we think that this is true, though class action lawsuits aren't really dependent on Champerty funding. Things like the ACLU, other nonprofit groups do this for free or from donor funding, right? There are various public interest groups, this sort of thing. There's contingency fee law firms, right? There is pay up all up front. Firms, this sort of thing, they can represent millions of plaintiffs and they take the risk themselves. That's how people sued big tobacco, big pharma, and chemical giants, this sort of thing. And then on the third point about how the government is often involved in class action lawsuits, not really sure, like we think that oftentimes like public defenders are able to in some way do the part of these like lawsuits, especially when the people being harmed are I guess harmed by the government or are being sued themselves. That's fine. On to the negation case. Our first contention is on court clog. The first point here is that hedge funds weaponize the court system, right? Litigation becomes an asset class in the government's world, right? Lawsuits stop being about justice and they become more about things like profit maximization, right? Because investors don't really care about the truth of a lawsuit or the fairness of the lawsuit. They care about taking on acceptable risk and returning the maximum financial return, right? There were big lawsuit wars recently between Pepsi and Coca-Cola that were waged through the lives of actual people who experienced minor harms by either corporation. The two just used these people as proxies to sue the other company. That's a huge waste of time and of space for the judicial system. The second point is on speculation. We think that funders pursue really high variance lawsuits, really lawsuits with huge upsides but capped downsides, right? Because they have a real capped downside in terms of loss of funding. But when the upside is huge, massive, like upside, then they're still willing to take that risk. This mirrors the subprime lending logic, right, from 2008, where investors are hunting for cases that like lawyers would never take because they're profit or they're merit poor, but they're really profit rich. We think that's also a waste of time in the judicial system when you have really frivolous lawsuits that claim huge damages. The third point is on time inflation. We think that funders always push lawyers to reject reasonable settlements because they want to chase bigger and bigger returns. So that means you draw out the amount of time it takes for a case to get fully litigated through, and we think longer cases means more, greater discovery burdens. You get more court appearances. The judicial system is just more overburdened and will probably buckle under this extended caseload. And we think that delays justice for all litigants, but especially for poor litigants in unrelated cases that Champerty doesn't affect. The fourth point is on gatekeeping. We think that judges generally can't see how the case is financed, right? Funding agreements are most of the time confidential, right? They can't just dismiss cases because they're investor backed. So like Champerty puts in a huge amount of volume and the judicial system has no way to filter any of that. The best example of this is in opioid lawsuits where corporations just had thousands of these cases and they were able to shut out a lot of real cases, which completely overwhelmed the judicial system. This is a real reason why Champerty is banned in many liberal states. I believe in California, New York. Across the board, in liberal states, it's generally banned. Fifth is on access failure. We think that when courts slow down, it's low-income plaintiffs, who have tenant disputes, maybe they have wage theft claims, right, domestic abuse cases, and they don't have large, payment expected, right, who are going to wait years and years for a hearing, whereas rich corporation, they can survive the delays, but poor people can't, right? Look to the Texas housing backlog. They're infamous for, years and years of delays on basic housing, illegal convictions. But Champerty cases, Champerty corporations would never pick up these cases because they don't have enough payoff. The sixth point is on copycat litigation. Champerty creates waves and waves of duplicate lawsuits because once a funder succeeds in a single lawsuit type, all other funders immediately finance dozens of similar claims, even if the underlying claims are weaker, because they're trying to flood the court system and get all of them accepted at the same time. This is what happened in, I believe, the Roundup cases, where courts were flooded with hundreds of nearly identical claims that really overwhelmed the system. So the impacts are twofold. First, you don't get any justice, right? Big cases eat up the already limited courtroom hours, and second, the quality of life decreases because poor people and people who actually need these lawsuits in order to survive don't get access to their important lawsuits in time or at all because the court is involved in all this frivolous argumentation. All right, the second argument or the second contention here is on exploitation of plaintiffs. The first point is that litigation funding is not charity. They're picking the best investments. Those are not small disputes, small claims that actually matter a lot to the people, but rather oh, my mug of coffee was too hot, so I'm going to sue Starbucks or things like that, right? Funders only take suits that have massive potential damages or really wealthy defendants, and so that excludes almost every case that poor individuals bring. Simple discrimination, harassment, wrongful termination, housing, medical harms, all of this. They're not actually taking these cases. And then secondly, even if they are taking these cases, Champerty is terrible because there's always priority repayment, right? The plaintiff often gets screwed. So the 8 point here is that the funder most of the time gets paid before the plaintiff gets a cent. So if the payment is over a long period, the funder gets a lot of payment before the plaintiff gets anything, which means that the plaintiff plaintiff isn't actually receiving, compensation for their damages in time. And then the B point is that, payments delayed for years because they're never going to settle. They're just always going to push it on and on. The C point here is that plaintiffs often have to fork over more than 33% if they can't pay up front, right? So this probably harms the worst well-off, while it helps the more well-off. And then the final point here is that multipliers and success fees significantly chip away any damages that the plaintiff actually gets. Most of the time, the percentage is just the bar, the starting point, right? After that, they add on additional fees that the litigation takes. Okay, my partner will get to a little bit more on this. The impacts here are, again, this is terrible for the judicial system and for any individuals that they claim to be helping. You can treat this as a turn of the entire AF case. We don't think that they're actually helping many people and instead are hurting the least well off. On to the AF case. Their first contention about better lawsuits, they claim that Champerty cases often want to settle out of court. We don't think this is true. We think Champerty always looks to find the biggest return on investment, which is most of the time going to be to continue litigating and litigating until you've ground away at the other side. That means there's more court time, and settling out of court is not an option. On their second point of settling in court, they claim that Champerty increases the chance of success for litigants. We think that they're picking cases that they're going to win. So this is perhaps correlation, not causation. The C point on how they can continue fighting litigation for a very long time, we think that's terrible for the judicial system at large. And on their final point about experts, we think that they're hand-picking experts that are going to sway the jury. These experts are not going to be reliable witnesses, but instead people that have long connections to the company and that the company is able to pay off because they have, this sort of connections. And these are not the cleanest companies on record. On their second contention about bigger corporations being better, we think that oftentimes companies sue other companies by proxy, which probably reduces the amount of money that they can spend on improving their products and eats up a lot of money on litigation. This probably turns the entirety of the contention because instead of better corporations, you get corporations that are super worried about offending any tiny law that might open them up to huge liability. This means that they have worse products and inferior product design. For all these reasons, we ask for a negation ballot, and we thank you.
Okay, lovely. I'm just gonna set my timer for 8:30. My name is Mina. I'll be the MG. The order will be top of case stuff. Our top of case, I'm gonna do a quick overview. I'm gonna go op case, then gov case. If anyone's not ready, please talk now. If not, my time will begin in the first word. Okay, so first what they tell you at this top of case is that they agree with all our definitions. Cool, awesome. And then they highlight here that we should be talking about the judicial system. I really agree with this. We should be talking about the judicial system. Obviously, in this round, that's what it's about. But we think that something that's really important about the judicial system is that it's supposed to be accessible to people and actually help them. What we see right now in the status quo is that the regular average day people whose lives might be worse because of pollution, whose lives might be worse because the products that they're eating are literally giving them cancer, have very few ways to actually get justice for those actions against them because corporations just have too much power. And that's really what we're trying to solve. And then secondly, a quick overview on all of my responses here, or all on op case here, is that they point out a lot of flaws with this plan, but they don't actually get to the real point of the issue, which is that overall, class action lawsuits right now in the status quo are not accessible to the average everyday American. So even if there are flaws with our side, it's still better to have this as an option rather than have no way for people to actually get legal advice, legal help, and get justice for crimes. Okay. And then they tell you on our second observation here that it's dependent on championship and it happens for free without championship. Basically that class action lawsuits happen in the status quo. However, it's a lot easier to get a class action lawsuit done when you are able to get money from other places that aren't just certain small groups of people who oftentimes don't have as much money as, say, private equity or an investment group who definitely has a lot more money than those groups in the status quo. So we see that when you have more money, you're able to fund more lawsuits. Pretty intuitive here. Secondly, they tell you that oftentimes public defenders, this is in response to our second observation, do the part of lawsuits and they're able to be there as legal aids. However, public defenders are often lacking in resources that that we can provide with Champerty, because their opponent isn't just one person who's like, I don't know, did a crime once upon a time. Instead, they're fighting this entire multinational corporation that has a lot more money, time, and resources than that one public defenders. It's not also Secondly, this isn't about public defenders, it's about public prosecutors, so this doesn't really make sense overall. Okay, now moving into opposition case on their C1s, they tell you that they're going to defend defund weaponized court systems. Their first subpoint here was about how judicial systems become about profit maximization. However, the judicial system still works. You aren't going to win a case if they are fake or wrong, or if they're like a weird case that's going to be put out there. In fact, we think that this especially incentivizes not taking those risks, because if you're putting money into, say, a lawsuit that's very frivolous and not important and is going to get thrown out by a judge, then it's going to get thrown out by a judge and you just wasted a bunch of money. You're taking these high risk investments that aren't going to pay off. So they're not going to be actually taking those types of risks. And if they do, then, and they win those cases, then that means that, you know, the justice system works. Obviously, those cases were actually causing people harm. Just because you might deem it to be frivolous, it is still something that harms someone, and we should get rid of that overall. Okay. And then secondly, they tell you under speculation that they pursue lawsuits for huge upsides with a lot of risks. However, again, this doesn't really make sense, because why would you pursue a lawsuit that has a lot of risks when you get zero payout if you do not don't win the case, right? They talk about like 2008 and how they basically did these certain types of like cases and lawsuits. However, they get paid initially, right? Those lawyers are getting paid initially. That doesn't happen here in this situation, because again, you only get paid if you win the lawsuit, not if you lose. Thirdly, they tell you about time inflation. They tell you that they reject bigger settlements for time, and the judicial system's going to be more burdened. However, we think that the vast majority of cases are settled outside of the court system. You're not actually going to see as much of a backlog as the opposition side would like to characterize, because again, those corporations don't want to waste time with those lawsuits being in the court system, because then they have to pour money into those cases. But secondly, and probably more importantly, they don't want the bad press. So they'd rather settle outside of court and make sure that they, like, I don't know, people are actually going to get their winnings. They're going to change the issue that was happening in the first place, but those people still get their justice overall. That's really good. But even if they do go to court, which is going to be a very slim amount of these cases, that type of bad press is going to further incentivize companies to do the right thing in the future. Either way, it's a win-win for us. And then also, we think that if the backlog is so high, as they would like to characterize, then you're ultimately going to get, I don't know, more courts, more judges, more those types of things to basically deal with that situation. Will it be immediate? Probably not, but we don't think the problem is going to be that big overall anyways. Fourthly, they tell you about gatekeeping. They tell you that funding is confidential. This just doesn't really matter overall, because that confidentiality doesn't change the fact of what's in the case, right? If the legal case is bad, if it's like funded by someone who's an outside source, it doesn't matter, because they're still funding a case that's a good case. Again, if they don't fund a good case, then there's no payout for them. They're going to be funding good cases. It's not going to actually cause this idea that they tell you about. Then fifthly, they tell you about access failure. They tell you that people who don't have large payouts are going to be harmed and they can't survive these delays. However, this is just, again, not true. Class action lawsuits, by definition, have smaller payouts for those individual people, but you're getting like a big overall pie. I mean, it depends. Some of them are big, some of them are small, but overall, the amount of payout for an individual person doesn't really matter and doesn't really actually affect if the lawsuit is going to be taken in the first place, because that slice of the pie that an individual person is getting is not the amount that's getting paid out to that investment group, right? Instead, it's going to be the amount coming out of that, like 33% of 33% from the initial legal fees. Legal fees don't really like this. The logic doesn't really make sense here. Okay, and then I already talked about backlogs. Then they tell you about copycat litigation. We think that, first of all, duplicates are actually settled quicker because there's legal precedent for it. It doesn't have to go through a lot of litigation. But secondly, and probably more importantly here, it's not a bad thing. If multiple corporations are doing the same bad action, then they should all get punished for doing that. That's pretty intuitive here. Then moving on to There's C2 about exploitation of plaintiffs. They tell you that they're going to pick the best investments. However, and with massive benefits, and it's going to exclude poor people. This really doesn't work with their own logic that they present earlier in the round, because they tell you that they're going to be choosing risky investments and then like wasting a lot of time in the court. So they can't really have their cake and eat it too here. But secondly, we think that we actually incentivize helping poor people because class action lawsuits are going to help them. And those regular cases that they talk about are non-applicable here because they aren't under this motion. They're not going through the same legal system. They're not affected in this round. It's non-topical. Okay, then they tell you that payments are going to be delayed because they never settle. That's really bad for companies and good for people because now they can afford to fight that fight if it's getting delayed, if it's going to take a long time, because they have investment groups behind them. In the status quo, they aren't able to do that. They have to drop the case and they get nothing, and they had to pay the legal fees. And we think that the fees don't go away with the plaintiffs because it comes out of the legal means. Now moving on to our side of the flow, most of this stuff like cross applies, and we think that like Champerty cares about getting justice and care about picking cases that are actually going to work. And then on our C2, we think that like those companies suing each other isn't actually a bad thing, because if they win those fights, that means that those corporations are doing bad things overall, and what we care about is the impact, not necessarily if a corporation is bad or acting like in a bad way, because if it's hurting a person, those people are going to get the payout. That's what we care about in this round. For all those reasons, could not be prouder to affirm. Thank you.
Okay, great speech. The order is going to be briefly on the framework, and then down the affirmation case, and then to the negative case.
So
Okay.
we'll get 8 minutes on this one for the app, and then 4 more minutes for the next speech.
Yeah, I probably will take 8:30 because the MG just took 8:30.
Yeah, that's fine.
Perfect. Okay, time begins in my first word. Big tobacco, big pharma, call these chemical giants. These have been insane class action lawsuits, the most prominent, the most famous class action lawsuits in American history in the last 15 to 20 years. Has Champerty ever been involved? No. Has the American public succeeded and won every single time? Yes. The reason why is they concede a couple of key reasons. The US already has class action lawsuits without Champerty. There's already things called contingency fee law firms that already pay all of the upfront costs, that already represent millions of plaintiffs. They already take the risks themselves. We've already sued big tobacco, big pharma, all these chemical giants without Champerty. Another like example we want to look to the big oil spills that have happened, like the Deepwater oil spill. We've sued like all of these corporations without Champerty. The largest civil settlements in American history have been done without Champerty. There's a reason why Champerty is banned right now. It is because it encourages a financial model where corporations completely destroy the concept of justice in the judicial system, turn justice into something that you can turn into profit, and completely backlog the justice system and turn them into a bunch of lawsuits that nobody actually wants. We are already solving for class action lawsuits inside opposition. Don't let them make you believe when they've not given you a single example of Champerty working in the rest of the world where it's actually helped. We give you examples why there's already alternatives that are solving much, much better. So don't buy the rhetoric here. Then go to the actually I'm going to go to the negative first because I think there's more ink here. The first thing they say here is that the judicial system still works even if you don't win a case that's wrong, and that frivolous lawsuits get thrown out by judges. And if they win cases, that means the justice system works. I think there needs to be a little bit more of a characterization coming here from the government. I think we need to spend more time in a court system here because government assumes that judges just magically filter out investor-driven abuse. But remember, to evaluate whether an argument or, for example, is like frivolous or not, you first need to evaluate it, which means that the judge can only dismiss a case after investors have already clogged the system with filings, motions, more demands, more appeals. Champerty already breaks the system before he's able to decide a decision, because oftentimes it's not going to be like 100% frivolous. There might be some merit to it, but definitely not warranted for the entirety of amount that it is. But the justices still have to evaluate the cases, which creates much more of a backlog. Then they say that why would you pursue lawsuits with lots of risk when you have zero pay if you don't win? This is not the model that people who are funding Champerty will do. They don't care about risk. They care about variance. They don't care about losing 10 small cases if they win one big case. They care about profit. They don't care about the risk. The government has a fundamentally misunderstanding of how the corporate or institutions that are funding Champerty behave and act. Like they care about variance. They do not care about risk. And judges cannot dismiss them fast enough, because the judges can't dismiss a case after the system has absorbed massive cost. And once again, Champerty also. Investors also win these cases because they distort the process. Winning does not mean merit. Like you don't have to I think we all know the justice system isn't like perfect. We don't the person who is objectively supposed to win doesn't win a lot of the time. A lot of these bigger corporations or bigger litigation firms are able to actually win these cases because they have like specific tricks they use in legal doctrine, or they have like specific more resources they can use, or they can use more tactics. There are a lot of tactics beyond the initial law that corporations can use. Investor-backed cases win because the opponent is financially exhausted, and this happens for years and years and years. And it's just a big war of attrition. Once again, extend the fact that funders seek high variance, so they are much more incentivized to like file 20 cases and then 19 of them failed, but one of them we got a massive settlement. So you're going to see massive amount of court influx into the system, because you know what, it's not that much if we file a case and we have to get paid and penalized. It's not that much, but if we win, the payout is significant. Okay. They also say backlog is solved by more courts and justice. No, impossible, and also empirically false. Courts do not scale like that. You can't instantly hire like hundreds of judges and also all these like clerks and infrastructure, blah, blah, blah. But also we say here that if you even increase your courts and justice, that would just increase the amount of Champerty cases. It's a self-defeating cycle that we say it's probably pretty bad insofar as you can never resolve it. And so there's no reason for you to vote for side affirmation insofar as the system is not broke right now. Class action lawsuits are already accessible. Some of the biggest major victories have been done. We've given you 5 examples of class action lawsuits that have worked without Champerty. There's no reason for this model that would allow for high variance cases and allow for litigation firms to pursue their own private interests and use people as proxies to effectively wage war on other corporations and competitors, and to completely backlog the court system that's already backlogged right now. Then extended exploitation of plaintiffs or plaintiffs argument. This goes like very, very like not responded to. We say here that like litigation funding isn't charity. The best investments are not. We say here that funders only take suits with massive potential damages. So a lot of this action of like they'll help like small class action lawsuits. Like no, they're only going to help class action lawsuits with the potential for like billions and billions and billions of dollars, and they can try and make it seem that way. And once again, the biggest impact here is even if the people in the class action lawsuit get a small settlement, the corporations are going to push for more and more and more because they want a higher return, which means that you buy that a lot of these people don't actually even get the money they deserve in the first place because they get screwed over. The payment is delayed for years. Plaintiffs have to fork over more than 33% they can't pay up front. There's success fees, there's hidden fees, there's multipliers. The funder gets paid. You strip the plaintiffs of autonomy, and whereas a lot of these alternatives, like a lot of these other institutions that are able to fund class action lawsuits, don't have these hidden fees, don't have the delayed payments. And because there's an invested corporate interest, you can probably assume they prioritize the profit over the people every single day, and will always try and get the hidden fees as much as possible.
And they advertise.
Yeah, and they advertise, which is like another unique reason to prefer us. Okay. Then go to the affirmation. On their first advantage, first contention about more/better lawsuits, we say the opposite is true. The only response to our case here is that companies suing each other is not a bad thing. I do not see a world in which this makes any sense. There are a bunch of reasons why this is bad. First, corporate versus corporate lawsuits substantially increase prices for the average consumer. We say here that like when corporates when competitors file frivolous lawsuits against other competitors, this is like, oh well, Pepsi versus Coca-Cola. We gave you this example. Well, they want to take out each other as much as possible, and so what they'll do is they'll say, oh, one person got harmed by something. There's some chemical here, so we're going to go and we're going to file a lawsuit that's like specifically based on this one specific minor thing, and they're going to file 20 of these lawsuits, and then we're going to hope that one of them works. This is pretty terrible insofar as this probably like makes it so that these corporations are like have to charge more, but also makes it so that you literally backlog cases that matter the most. And guess what? Justices are unfortunately swayed by money, and the sense is here that they will be prioritizing these corporate versus corporate lawsuits instead of the lawsuits that actually are affecting the average day person, which is pretty bad because you have less justice. Then you can also extend a lot of the terms we give you, that like corporate litigation is zero about accountability and all about competitive sabotage. They block competitors. There's like patient wars. There's antitrust harassment. There's so many ways for you to just like make a bunch of these lawsuits that like, oh, well, like we'll throw a bunch of darts and see which one sticks. And this is pretty bad because it clogs the legal system, which you can't ever turn. And also, there's no reason. There's no reason for you to vote for side affirmation because we're already solving for class action lawsuits on our side of the house. We already have expert witnesses. We already have PhD investigators, and we already have people that funders that fight. Or we are on their side. Their funders fight for the investors and not for the victims because funders do not care about corporate reform. You're never going to get more companies that are better accountable because they're never going to change. Once again, these are frivolous lawsuits, and funders do not pick cases that improve society. They will pick cases that improve their profit, which means at the end of the line, they're going to go for this climate change impact. They're going to go for this argument. The whole PMR is going to be an argument about how, well, you as an average person should be held, hoping and holding corporates accountable. And this is the way to do it. No, because we already do that on our side of the house. And what this encourages is companies and corporations suing each other for a competitive advantage, which just further incentivize them to do frisky and frivolous and risky things so they can get more money and they can skirt out the justice system for all these reasons I proudly negate.
All right. Sorry. All right. My name's Thomas Greenleaf. Again, I will be the third and final speaker for side negation. I have 4 minutes and I guess a 30-second grace. I'll just be going through top of case, what you can be voting on, negation, affirmation. Is everyone ready? All right. My time will start on my first word. 3, 2, 1. Now, okay, from the top of case, from the framework, you can draw away a few things. First of all, I think we've proven pretty clearly that Champerty is not necessary for class action lawsuits. Again, the resolution doesn't only cover class action lawsuits, but most of the affirmation's offense is centered around class action lawsuits. Again, we give you the example of basically all recent class action litigation has been funded not by Champerty, but rather by other funding structures, by private donors, by things like the ACLU, and various other like non-profit organizations that believe in what they are fighting for. This sort of thing solves for class action lawsuits, whereas on the affirmation, they've given you no real example of a Champerty class action lawsuit that has actually improved the world, that has helped the people that it purports to, and that has made the companies more accountable or whatnot. So again, I think immediately you can just buy that only side negation has real solvency. We're the only side that actually helps people, that actually has class action lawsuits, and that actually uses the judicial system properly. This is why most liberal states have already banned and are banning in the status quo Champerty lawsuits. Okay, now on the negation. There are a few points where you can easily vote. First of all, we've proven that Champerty breaks the system. Remember, Champerty cases, the people who fund Champerty cases, they do not care about like risk that much, right? Because the odds to them are like, okay, we have maybe a 10% chance of winning this case. But if we do win this case, we're going to get $20 million, right? And it only costs like 100 grand to put it forward. So we may as well do it, right? That means that they're incentivized to flood the judicial system. And this is what you see in places where Champerty is legalized. You see a flooding of the judicial system. If nothing else, you can buy that the judicial system is awash with these frivolous cases, which, even if they're dismissed on face, takes a lot of time for justices to review. That takes away from actual cases by poor people, by people who can't afford this sort of thing, who don't have these crazy claims, these liability claims, right? By people who are looking to get some wage reimbursement for, small discrimination claims against small businesses. This sort of thing, it hurts these people because it delays their cases, it makes them wait for years, and it makes the justices more, stressed, more go through cases more quickly. It makes them throw out a lot of legitimate cases in trying to get rid of all the garbage that's being thrown in by Champerty. Again, you're breaking the judicial system and you cannot fix it. You cannot solve this court clog because courts do not scale. It would take years and years to add additional courts. It might not even be constitutional in cases or in federal cases, right? That's a huge infrastructure cost. And if anything else, it just increases the amount of Champerty cases because now Champerty has lower downside because it's easier to litigate, right? So at the very worst, you cannot solve court clog. And this is the most important voter on your ballot because this hurts everyone in the judicial judicial system. Okay, again, on the negation, like corporations run a cost-benefit analysis. They have capped downside and they have nearly uncapped upside. They can just, play whack. They can use hundreds and hundreds of cases. It does not matter to them so long as they hit once, right? And plaintiffs are screwed over. Remember, the affirmation has dropped a few key points on our second contention. They've dropped that priority repayment is standard in the industry. The plaintiff gets screwed for the cost because the founder always gets paid before the plaintiff gets a cent. Payment is delayed for years, and these funders often don't want to settle because they want to gain the maximum payments they possibly can, which means that the plaintiffs never get their damages in time. But also, there are plenty of fees that are separate from this fixed percentage cost, which means that it's unlikely that the plaintiff will get much, if anything. So for all these reasons, we don't think it's good for the individual plaintiffs. On the affirmation case, you can just buy that our case basically cross-applies to the entirety of theirs. On their first contention of more or better lawsuits, we think this is an independent link into our court clog argument. If there are more lawsuits, there's more court clog. But also, like, they're only picking cases that they're going to win. They're ripping off defendants who would have won in either world. They're not actually helping people who couldn't have won without them, right? They're picking, frivolous lawsuits. They're not picking things that help other people. On their second contention, you can just cross-apply a lot of my partners' responses on their second contention of hurting big corporations. Again, if corporations are suing each other, that does not help the consumer, and that hurts everyone. For all these reasons, because we think Champerty lawsuits are a disgrace, we ask for a negation ballot. Thank you.
Okay.
So, okay, we'll have the final speaker. All right. We have 5 minutes and 30 seconds.
Yep. All right. I'm just going to start with some responses. Then I'm going to explain how we win here. My time will start in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so first, Champerty is mostly used for class action lawsuits. That's what it said in the motion, so don't let Op try to talk about something else here. Secondly, and more importantly, we aren't providing examples because this is partly, and we can't research per rules to do so, but also because it just doesn't happen right now. We're not the status quo. So what do we see because Champerty doesn't exist? Majority of foods cause terrible cancer and have carcinogens, terrible side effects of drugs, insane amounts of pollution that hurt the average person. Because the average person does not have legal or financial means to pursue lawsuits. We tell you this in PMC and it never gets responded to. Just because some class actions exist in the status quo doesn't mean that we shouldn't improve upon that, and that doesn't mean that there are enough. The fact of the matter is that the average American is constantly being affected by bad products in the status quo. Think about how many products cause cancer, or people affected by polluted water that poisons their bodies, or people without enough water. Just because Op would like you to believe that good enough is good doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue to fight for more for American people. Okay, so now on this point of legal backlog, what Op really tries to do is make you forget about the simple fact that if this case is bad, then it will get thrown out. They argue that they will file so many cases because they only need one payout, but the math doesn't actually work out. First, and probably more importantly, the government/legal body has to agree to take on the case in the first place. This takes time and money, which means corporations have to invest so much to even do this in the first place. Secondly, those initial fees are expensive. It isn't a small amount of money that they're forking over. It takes a lot of money to get a class action lawsuit started in the first place. Thirdly, these cases will be settled in the first place. A vast majority of cases don't even go to court. It doesn't take as much time, as they say, to increase courts, right? We see all of this stuff because, we see that corporations just aren't going to pursue things for no reason, and that they're not just going to do this and overrun courts with all of this stuff because it takes a lot to pursue this, so the risk involved is just not enough. Okay, also, corporations are actors. Op tries to tell you a lot of work about why corporations suing each other is bad, but they don't care about the average consumer, and that they don't care about the average consumer, etc. But what they miss here is that even if they are doing it, that they're doing it because they want to beat their competition, the claim that they have has to be at least a little bit valid. Ultimately, that doesn't just help the plaintiff, but every other consumer ever. Corporations do not want to hurt their business by continuing bad business practices. They want to maximize profit, which ultimately helps the consumer. This kind of self-regulates. So what we see here is that a lot of side opposition's case simply doesn't make sense. They tell you corporations want to pick cases that give you lots of payouts, and then they'll ignore that a lot of people really need help, and then they tell you that corporations pick cases that actually win. This is contradictory. Cases that actually win and have benefits for the investors are also cases that have large harms and are cases that actually hurt people. They also tell you about case duplicates and act as if this clogs the court system, but what we really see is that it's easy for people who have been harmed to get compensation. And if courts are really flooded here, which we don't think that they will because these courts get settled faster, it is good because it means that more people who were harmed receive justice. They try to talk about other types of lawsuits that supposedly get slowed in the backlog, but these cases are not in the same courts. It's completely different. It's not relevant to the round. They claim that companies pursue trivial things, but clearly actual trivial things will get dismissed.
The argument that all these other lawsuits are in a different court system than the one that we've been talking about for this entire round is pretty new in the PMR. A response to an LOC argument should have been made in the MG specifically.
My partner made this response. She called these points non-topical.
Yeah.
What Maggie said.
Yeah, if I just may clarify, like what we're saying specifically is that you're like, yeah, you talked about like other what's it called? Like it's not topical because you're talking about class action lawsuits, but the idea that like there's other courts for other things and that like it doesn't get clogged is like a very new response to like an LOC argument that should have been, I don't know, judge's discretion.
That is a new argument. I agree. That wasn't necessarily specifically mentioned before.
Okay. All right, I'll restart my time in 3, 2, 1. So in the they also claim, they try to claim that corporations pursue trivial things, but clearly actual trivial things get dismissed. If there's a big reward for investors, it must have also been a big harm for citizens. They also claim that corporations are oh so busy, they don't have time. Then why would they waste time on trivial things? What they try to do here is dump a whole bunch of points on you, but we ultimately see that through my partner's responses, the majority of these points simply don't make sense and are completely irrelevant to the round. So what actually matters here? In the status quo, corporations have massive amounts of power and massive influence, and a lot of times they do massive harm. They try to point to a few examples of class action lawsuits hurting, but in reality, we have more and better class action lawsuits working on our side, which helps solve this problem. Slide Up tries to tell you that the judicial system will be overrun and that people won't actually get power. We see that this is not true for a few reasons. They tell you people prosecuting don't have resources to wait, but on GovSide, Champerty gives them these resources, which means they go longer. Which means that they can go on for longer. They talk about frivolous cases. These don't actually happen. They're meritless and not worth investing in, and the court will just reject them. They also tell you that lawsuits happen slower, but they actually happen faster because there is more precedence and more resources and just more things to help these lawsuits happen faster in general. So we see that these courts aren't unreasonably overrun and that the cases that are there are going to be better cases. They're going to be stronger cases. So here are some points that you can easily vote on for side government. So even at Ops best, where the courts have backlog, at least the cases are being heard in the first place. People are getting justice in the long term versus getting nothing and never improving the system, right? So even if you buy that these courts have backlog, the people whose cases are now being heard through this backlog still were harmed and still deserve compensation. We should increase access to justice rather than limiting it. On our side, we have more class action litigation actually happening. People, small or large harms, actually get paid out. And with a wider impact here, corporations are forced to stop these harmful practices because the cost of them is becoming too much. We also see that lawsuits on our side is faster because more lawsuits are happening, so more precedent. This isn't a perfect system, but it's better than the alternative. Couldn't be prouder to affirm. Thank you.
Good debate, guys.
Good round, guys.
Good round.
All right, so